Thank you, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here at Universidad Francisco Marroquín, that I've been practicing how to say. As you now know, I'm a sociologist, and I'm going to talk to you about sociology and classical liberalism. But I think it is important that you understand something about me first, that I want to exemplify with these. So Jim Coleman is Mr. Rational Choice Sociology. So I do research on social networks, and I'm very much done stuff that relates to Thomas Schelling's segregation models, which you might or might not be familiar with. And Robert Merton is one of my heroes. He's a great sociologist who was alerting us a great deal to notions of unintended consequences, very much similar to what some of the political economists talk about. Another thing is that I'm a number cruncher empirical sociologist, okay? And why do I say that? Well, because I'm kind of trained in this scientific manner. And today I'm going to talk to you about very soft notions of sociology. I'm going to talk to you about culture and virtues and mores and social norms and try to relay some of these notions that sociologists have and think of as natural things in human interaction, in the social context of all of our social everyday lives. And these are not really topics of rational choice sociology, okay? So I'm exploring them together with you. I'm not an expert on this. Hence, I'm not a student of the classics. The people I'm going to talk to you about today in some detail, or not that much detail actually, I'm going to try to introduce you to some of the classical liberal sociologists that are now forgotten. I'm not really a student of them. I just wish there were more available in our discipline. So I'm going to speak of sociology, although I do think that the situation we have in sociology kind of generalizes across social sciences and humanities. There's very little classical liberal notions and ideas in those disciplines. And I also want to alert you to that I do think that disciplinary boundaries should largely be ignored. I'm trained as a rational choice sociologist. I often feel like I have much more in common with economists than I do with qualitative-oriented sociologists. So, you know, it's just made up, socially constructed. So, what's the situation like in today's sociology? Well, we do have a very good representation of Marxist sociology, of critical theory or public sociology, which are all sort of left-leaning notions of a society where power struggles and strife and conflict is sort of the everyday existence that we live in. And it's very well represented. But I will show you how the classical liberal tradition of sociology is largely forgotten. This is one way to look at it. I searched for classical liberal sociology in Google Scholar, and I got one hit. This was in 2013, I believe. I did it again yesterday, and I found that we've increased our numbers by 100%. I was very enthusiastic, and I thought, this is a positive trend. We now get 2 hits when we search for classical liberal sociology online in Google Scholar. So I needed to compare that to something. So I did the same for Marxist sociology. And when I did it in 2013, I got 3,690 hits. They're slightly more common that people talk about and write about Marxist sociology than classical liberal sociology. But although their numbers are also increasing, it's only a 36% increase. So we're catching up. So what then would classical liberal sociology be about? Well, if you look at and focus on people who sort of identify themselves as sociologists, and at the same time identify themselves as classical liberal scholars, or liberals as they were called in those days, you can quickly find three people. One is Herbert Spencer. You might have heard his name perhaps before. The other person is Harriet Martineau, a Brit. And the third is William Graham Sumner. Okay. And what were these sort of proto-early sociologists studying and talking about? Well, Herbert Spencer wrote a three-volume set of books on the principles of sociology. But he also wrote The Man versus the State, which is still available today in Liberty Fund, the Liberty Fund Connection, for instance, where he heavily criticized what he saw as the liberal failings of his time, or the new liberals sort of abandoning liberal principles. But for sociologists, Spencer wrote about society as an evolutionary process. He thought that he was a very sort of scientific person who thought that, society is progressing from what he's thought of as military society, where, societies were hierarchical, where notions of obedience were very pressing, and simple and undifferentiated. You were doing what you were told, and you listened to the king, or whoever it was that ruled over you. He contrasted this to industrial society, which he characterized as voluntary societies. Whether or not you wanted to obey or do something was up to you, which was much more based on contracts, and that were complex and differentiated. Okay? So no longer just one type of people, but very many. These dichotomies of societies developing is very familiar to students of sociology. I don't know if you study sociology at all, but if you do, you will come into contact with notions of Emile Durkheim's going from a mechanical society to an organic society, which is very much a ripoff of Spencer. We have Tön is coming from from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft, etc. Okay. So Spencer was saying basically that societies evolve over time. And he was under the impression that he could find some kind of natural law by which we could figure this out. I'm skeptical towards that idea, but I do think that the evolutionary notions of Spencer is actually something we should talk about and explore even today. Another thing that I really think is one of the cooler laws that Spencer formulated, and I want to credit that this is actually something that Steve Davis has written on in Ideas on Liberty, is the notion that in society, the degree of public concern and anxiety about a social problem or phenomenon varies inversely as to its real or actual incidence. So basically what Spencer formulated as a societal law here is that, the more a social problem is about to be resolved, okay, the more people are going to get hysterical about it. And we sometimes, I see that this again and again also in modern societies, where it's like, it's almost not a problem anymore, and then people get really, eager to solve it. It's like, no, it has to disappear. And most of the time, they then call for state solutions to the problem. Okay. And he discusses in his text alcohol, education, poverty, the status of, and treatment of women and children in society. In his time, these were the sort of examples he saw. Harriet Martineau, on the other hand, is often credited to have written 2 sociology books. One is One is How to Observe Manners and Morals, which basically is a methods book. It's a book about how you can immerse yourself in local societies and learn and study morals and manners. Okay? What makes this book unique and a real contribution to science is that she really was very much not a cultural imperialist in doing this. She was very much of the notion that you need to, go with the natives and understand how their versions of morals and manners is what matters. Okay? So she was kind of saying we have to take a step back from our own worldview in order to learn about others. Okay. The other book she wrote that is credited as a sociology book is Society in America. She wrote this after a study trip to the US, and she came back being very anti-slavery. And in the book, she argues that this is unsustainable. American individualistic principles, what she saw as like the founding principles in America of individualism and freedom for all and the pursuit of happiness or whatever you want to talk about it, is very contrary to slavery and the hierarchical principles that a slave society rests upon, basically. She also wrote a book called The Factory Controversy, which I think would be great if sociology students in the world read today. The undertitle says it all, I think. A warning against meddling legislation. Okay. She's, in the book, basically argues that, we see social problems every day in industrial society. I mean, she's writing this book in 1855. Factory conditions were probably horrendous, right? Probably, it was dangerous to work there and people were not happy on the job place and so forth. And she said, that's fine, and we should try to remedy and make society better, but not by using legislation. Okay? The meddling legislation. Very much aware of and attuned to the notion that legislation on these moral issues, on how to treat employees, etc., tend to have a bunch of unintended consequences and turn out to actually not be that helpful in the end. The next person I want to talk about is William Graham Sumner. He wrote a book called Folkways, a study of the sociological importance of usages, manners, custom, mores, and morals. Okay? And for those of you who haven't studied sociology, folkways are just kind of what people do in their everyday interaction. How you, for instance, stand in line when you wait for the bus, or not, depending on your context. If you raise your hand to get, permission to speak, or if you don't, depending on, on the folkways of your local context. Mores, on the other hand, are norms with a much stronger moral sanction. So these are notions and ideas about what's right and what's wrong in society. Okay. The other words, I think, you can sort of make sense of anyway. Okay, 3 examples. All sociologists, all classical liberals. These people are seldom heard of or covered in our introductory textbooks. And part of the answer is, of course, that we have a strong norm of scientism in sociology, as in all social sciences, I think, of today, which sort of pretends that ideas do not matter. As a scholar or a scientist, you should be objective. Your own personal values should not influence your scholarship. But when it's one-sided in the way that classical liberal ideas are sort of eliminated from discourse, it becomes damaging to scholarship, because ideas is, after all, what science is all about, right? Another explanation is that oftentimes, if classical liberal ideas are presented in our sociology textbooks, they are presented as there was classical liberal ideas. Oh yes, Spencer and Martineau and some other weird people. But then came the socialists, and so now we have social democracy, okay? Taking the best from the classical liberals, meshing it up some with the Marxist ideas, and no, we have evolved into an enlightened fashion where, we all can agree that social democracy is the best way. The one classic who is both a liberal and a sociologist and who has survived our textbook treatment is Max Weber. I don't know if you are familiar with Max Weber. His notions he's one of the giants in sociology. Together with Marx and Émile Durkheim, Max Weber is like the third person you immediately will learn of in Introduction to Sociology. And he's a liberal. But that is never mentioned in textbooks. So it's like ignored, and partly because of this. Weber is a very important sociologist because he came from a historical school of economics, which was a school of thought in economics that emphasized context. Okay. So basically the notion was that economic life cannot be understood and occur within the context of the historical development of the culture as a whole. So his idea was that you can't really study economic development unless you understand culture, ideas, what goes on in people's head at the time. Okay? Sounds very Hayekian, I think, sort of, at least. He's also very much part of the hermeneutical tradition, if you know what that is, where it's sort of insisting on individuals being inherently, to understand individuals, you need to understand what's meaningful in their heads. Famously, in Weber's writing, a notion of verstehen. You have to really understand, you have to, talk to people, understand what's going on in their life. The most perhaps famous book of his is The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. So this book was first published as articles in 1904 and 5, and it was very much in conversation with Marxist ideas of historical materialism. No, says Weber. It's not only the material world that matters. To understand why capitalism emerged the way it does, you need to understand the ethic of the people and the spirit of the time, right? Two words that are like extremely hard to, like, what does that even mean? Okay, but he had an idea about that. And he's basically saying that we need to understand the religious ideas that kind of shaped capitalistic notions, or why capitalism arose when it did. Okay? And the reason is that magical and religious forces and the ethical ideas of duty based upon them have in the past always been among the most important formative influences on conduct. So basically he's saying, like, you have to understand that in order for capitalism to actually happen and make sense and be supported and seen as legitimate in society, something good, okay, you need the moral authority that, religion has given them, okay? And his hypothesis, or the idea that he presented then, is that what happened was that, Protestantism came about. And all of a sudden, it was okay to make money. It was okay to be an entrepreneur. It was okay to think outside your box, so to speak. Okay. So why did the classical liberal tradition disappear? Well, I already sort of told you a little bit about it, but something that did happen and that I think was extremely effective was that classical liberal sociologists Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner got smeared by notions of social Darwinism. To some extent, perhaps justifiably so, especially in Spencer's case. You know, people who actually study this and are involved in the debate, they say Spencer wasn't even a Darwinian, he was a Lamarckian, right? And people who are involved in this said William Graham Sumner never even called himself a Darwinist, okay? They only had notions that societies evolve. Okay? Seems extremely non-controversial to anyone today. But what happens is that these texts, attacking them and smearing them with social Darwinism, was so powerful that people stopped reading them. Okay? So they just like, oh no, Spencer, you don't want to read him. He's a social Darwinist. Who wants to be, you know, a social Darwinist? And so, you know, they just came off the shelf. And then, of course, the 1960s and 70s happens. But this is the era when both sociology became extremely popular, but also extremely inhabited with left-wing academics. So we also see that there's a whole new generation out there who dislike Western civilization, okay? They say, oh, class, power, race, and gender, that's what we should focus about. And capitalism is making things, you know, bad for, you know, different people. C. Wright Mills, a famous left-wing sociologist, critiqued what was called functionalist theory, sort of the notion that societies function and evolve, and, you know, it's like, no, that's not. It's power struggles, you know, it's conflict, it's, you know, critical theory. And in this period, too, of course, Marx is added to the classic text in sociology. So, does it matter? It doesn't matter for society at large, perhaps, in other manners that, you know, ideas are not presented properly. To scholarship, I mean, ideas of liberty should inform every notion of scholarship. Ideas of individual responsibility and dignity, of fostering moral sentiments, are worthy ideas to explore in social science. And in particular, in a social science that very much deals with the social realm, just like sociology does. Okay? The context of society. So I think that classical liberal sociology has stuff to offer us also today. One idea that I think is worth re-exploring is evolutionary thinking. Okay, we should go back to Spencer and Sumner and study what were they thinking when they were talking about societies evolving. Okay, and especially since they were so good at actually understanding notions of coercion and state investigations. These kind of collectivist instincts and sensibilities and traditions. Because they really did, I mean, Spencer definitely, and I think Sumner, Martineau, all of those guys saw very clearly how these collectivists' impulse to call upon the state to solve social problems was dysfunctional, and that it undermines virtues, responsibilities, and dignities. Okay, social norms, as would be another way of expressing that. And Edward Shields, one of the sociologists that I didn't really talk about, calls this civility. And he in his text, he sort of says that civility is something that we need to nurture because it's a skill of the free to be civil. If you are free and uncivil, it's not going to work, right? So you need for people to be both free and civil, okay? And that civility is really a necessary virtue to sustain liberty. And with civility, he meant good manners, actually being nice, but also a concern for the public good, okay? Not only caring about you, yourself, and I, but also to actually work for and promote the public good. I like to think of this civility and the notions of individual responsibility in terms of Adam Smith's social distance theory. Why I like this? Well, because I am trained, after all, as a rational choice sociologist. So in the center, or the first ring here, there's me. Okay. I care about me. I'm going to take responsibility of me, and I know what I want, etc. But it doesn't end there. In the next layer, there's the people around me that I care for. Okay? My family, cousins, workmates, other people, okay, that I have close ties to. And I care for them, not perhaps as much as I care for me, but I don't really not care for them. And next are the cross-cutting ties. My neighborhoods, my neighbors, my daughter's school friends, parents, all these other people we are in contact with during our day. And in the end, it's like others in general, humankind, people in China, okay? The poor, whatever, the poor, the suffering, everybody else. Okay? So I don't care for them as much as I care about myself, and I can't affect their life as much as I can affect mine. But it's not like we should only think that humans are sort of this, is my idea. Because one of the greatest things about sociology is that it makes us very much attuned to our social instincts. The total natural notions that individuals build ties to other individuals. Okay. In the waiting room with the doctor, you chat with people. You stand in line at the cinema, you talk to the one behind you. At least I do. Just to spend some time, or because you're wondering, and so on. And of course, the social impulse that we have is, builds our reputation as a good or bad person. It makes us also develop a conscience, okay, that we do care about others, and if we behave badly towards someone, we feel bad about that. Okay. Again, norms. We want to be honest, and so forth. So we develop these norms of cooperation, we develop norms of consideration, okay? And it's not that hard. And I think, for those of you who are a little bit familiar with behavioral economics, you know that this is true, and sociologists have known it all along, okay? The reason I want to point out this to you is that if you look at the classical liberal sociologists, they were all strong individualists. They were not traditionalists. They were very much saying, like, yes, individuals should be free to do whatever they want. You can trust them to care for themselves, okay? Because they have common sense, they're reasonable, and they know how to take care of themselves. But they also, as you saw of the book titles, they were very interested in mores, they were interested in norms, the social context, okay, what it meant to, be a human being. And they saw no contradiction in this, okay? So they found it extremely natural that individuals also develop moral sentiments, sympathy. So we can also kind of count on them to care for the public good, okay? And if you understand that, you can sort of see why they necessarily didn't think that the meddling legislature had to be called upon as soon as a social problem was discovered or something was going wrong, okay? So instead of thinking of in terms of interest groups, conflicts, power struggles, I think a classical liberal sociology alerts us to also think of the common ground, the win-win in human interaction, okay? The potential for cooperation and common problem solving, okay? And the good thing about that is, to remind you again of Shields and the civility thing, is that by having that attitude, by actually thinking that individuals can be relied upon to take care of themselves and so forth, you also nurture a culture that's important to sustain liberty, a culture of self-reliance, of virtues, and of trust. Okay? De Tocqueville very much was talking about this type of individualism when he described America and the American individualists as people who were self-reliant, who worked together, who built churches, who took care of one another, and so forth and so forth. Very utopian, of course. So, classical liberal sociology can bring to the study of classical liberal further study in such things as virtues, tradition, culture, mores, folkways, and, look at Martineau. How do we study these things? Okay? What does it mean? How do they impact societal development? Okay? What are good ones? What are bad ones? And what happens when they disappear or change? Okay? So it's, I think, one of the contributions that classical liberal sociology has to offer. Okay? This is going to sound a little warm and fuzzy, perhaps, but I also think that this type of liberalism, the sort of sociological approach to classical liberalism, it's a little bit warmer, okay? Because it doesn't really rely on just like the cold utility maximizing man, okay, who only cares about profits or efficiencies, the stuff you learn about in economics. Okay, I can say this because I'm married to an economist. That in itself, I think, is actually also something that would benefit classical liberalism, to get away from this notion of like cold-bloodedness that I sometimes think it is very much attached to. And the virtues of that would be that I think more women would be attracted to the ideas. Okay, so I consider myself a classical liberal woman, and I don't have many comrades in the world, especially not in my field, not in the world in general. It's clear that, for some reason this my hypothesis, I should say, is that partly it's because women care for others. And they're like, this doesn't appeal to me. I'm going to study nursing or be a social democrat. Okay? And of course, classical liberals' ideas would also get, infiltrate sociology. Okay? So also sociologists would talk about liberty, okay? Would be in tune to unintended consequences and so forth. I don't know. But that's all I had to say. So thank you for listening.